everyone. Welcome to our Bay State Bike Month kickoff webinar with Marley Blonsky. My name is Jess Slavin. I'm Mass Bike's Communications Director. We're really excited to have Marley Blonsky here with us. She is the co-founder and executive director of All Bodies on Bikes that's working towards size inclusion in cycling. And I know she has a pretty jam-packed presentation for us. So I'm going to hand it over to Marley.
Thank you so much, Jess. Hi, everyone. My name is Marley. I live in Bentonville, Arkansas, but I'm currently in Emporia, Kansas. If folks have heard about Unbound Gravel, I am up here helping them get ready for that. So the life of a nonprofit executive director who's not getting paid for that work, I just kind of take whatever roles I can get. And the reason I say that is we might be interrupted at some point, and I sincerely apologize for that, but we're going to do our best to make it through this. So I'm really excited to share this presentation. I did a very similar one for the Maine Bicycle Coalition, and it went over so well that Jess was like, let's do this for us. So I'm really excited to share this presentation. And like she said, I have a very jam-packed presentation, so I'm going to dive right into it. It is also being recorded, and I'm happy to send these slides out later if there's stuff in there that you're like, whoa, I want to see that again. So like Jess said, I'm co-founder of All Bodies on Bikes, and I'm also a professional cyclist. It feels so weird to say that because especially if you look at me in this photo, I don't look like most professional cyclists that you've seen. But I do get paid by brands like Shimano, Cannondale, a couple others, Laser, and I like to be transparent about that of where my money is coming from. And that's the only reason why I put that in there. So my motto as we go through this, and our motto with All Bodies on Bikes, is that all bodies are good bodies, all bikes are good bikes, and all rides should be celebrated. This is a picture of me in, oh my gosh, 10 years ago now, with my first adult bike. As you can tell, it doesn't fit very well. It's a little big for me. It's got steel wheels. The wheels are about as tall as I am, but I loved that bike so much. It really opened up the world of bicycles to me, and started me on this whole adventure. So we're going to time travel for a minute. So 2014, I don't know if you guys remember, Obama was president. Things seemed really good and it was really exciting. But personally, I was freshly divorced, and I decided I wanted to ride a bike. Some of the constraints I was working around, I'm 5'1". I'm not a tall person. I weighed around 250 pounds at the time, and my budget was less than $400. And even 10 years ago, that was not a whole lot of money to get onto a bike with. And so that's how I landed on this beauty of a bike. And it worked pretty well for commuting, and that's what I was doing at the time. But as I got more adventurous, and realized I needed a stronger bicycle. I had signed up for Bike MS, so I needed something that could go the distance. I got this cute little road bike. But within 1 month of getting that bike, I had 3 flat tires, I had 2 broken spokes, I had broken the seat post. I had started going on group rides because that's what I thought you were supposed to do. I got dropped twice, which I think is a pretty relatable thing for, especially for newer cyclists. But I was still commuting daily to work and absolutely loving it. You look at that list of challenges that I ran into and you say, why in the heck did you keep riding? I think most folks, even with 1 flat tire or 2, that can be enough to put the bike away and say, nope, this isn't for me. But for me, I had found a sense of community. I had found a sense of joy, which was severely lacking as a freshly divorced person, if anybody's ever gone through that transition in their lives. But also just a stupid determination that I had loved the bike so much as a kid, and I knew that I could find that same sense of joy and a bike that would work for me. I eventually, actually pretty soon after Bike MS, I got a new bike on the recommendation of a trusted bike shop owner and mechanic who I kept taking my broken spokes to. And finally he was like, Marley, we need to get you on a stronger bike that's going to work for the type of adventures you're going on. And huge kudos to him. We never talked about weight limits. It was just a conversation of you need to be on a stronger, more robust bicycle. Around that time, I started bike packing. This picture was actually taken in Canada. If anybody's ever gotten the chance to bike pack around Victoria, I highly recommend it. It is absolutely incredible. Around that time, I also started blogging my adventures, sharing gear lists, telling stories, and sharing a lot of the equipment challenges I was having. You can see in a lot of these pictures, I'm not wearing bike clothes necessarily. Well, here I am because I was riding Bike MS and I bought the kit from my company and was deeply uncomfortable all weekend long because it just didn't fit correctly. You can see here, I do have a pair of terry shorts on, but it still wasn't quite what I needed. And through sharing those stories, I realized that I wasn't the only one facing these equipment challenges. Around that same time, I ran into my co-founder, Kaylee Kornhauser, on Instagram. She was riding across Alaska on a sponsored trip and didn't have a raincoat. So I slid into her DMs and I said, let's talk. I already had the ear of some of the bike industry just via Twitter, and had written a couple columns for a local cycling advocacy organization and done a couple presentations, but we kind of had this realization that we were onto something. Around that same time, especially with Kaylee's leadership, I stopped apologizing. I realized this is my body. It is powerful. It is strong. And I started realizing that I could be an advocate for other people in bigger bodies. This is around the time when I started discovering fat community and fat activism. This was like 2018, 2019. A lot of those communities were just kind of starting to form. But I realized that indeed, I am not the only person in a bigger body. In fact, about 70% of the US lives in a bigger body. And I'm happy to provide the stats on this. It basically comes from the Centers for Disease Control, their classifications of obese and overweight. I hate using those words, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, realized I was not alone, and there was a huge opportunity to make cycling better for all of these people who also lived in bigger bodies. This is a picture from our very first presentation. We had gone to the WTF Bike Explorers Retreat in Oregon, and we gave our first presentation about size inclusion in cycling. And you can see, a lot of the things that we're actually going to talk about here in a little bit: weight limits, components, finding gear, finding clothing, all of those things. After we started doing these presentations, we were invited to the League of American Bicyclists. If folks are familiar with that organization, they have their annual summit every year, and this was in spring of 2020. We started fundraising, and there was an article written about us in the Washington Post, and that kind of started this whole adventure towards all bodies on bikes. Obviously, maybe not obviously, it's seemed to have a collective forgetting about COVID, but the conference in spring 2020 didn't happen. We ended up doing it online, and that was the biggest blessing that we could have had, because instead of presenting to 30 people in a room, we had a couple hundred, and it was recorded and shared out. One of the effects of that was Shimano heard our story and said, we want to do some storytelling around this. And that's when the All Bodies on Bikes film was made. So we made that in summer of 2020. It came out in spring of 2021, and life has been a rocket ship ever since. When the film was made, we had no plans on turning this into a nonprofit. It was like, let's tell our story about how challenging it is to be a serious cyclist in a bigger body. The challenges that we have in finding community, the challenges of, our own bodies, but also the joy and the triumph. And when the film came out, I had this vision of, I think this could be more than just a film. We could lead rides when we go places, and we were already doing that. This could potentially have chapters, and I didn't really know what that would look like now or at the time. But fast forward 3 years later, we are a 501c3. We have 13 chapters across the United States and growing. Last year we led 69 rides, impacting over 5,000 riders. I need to update this slide. But we are recognized leaders in the cycling world, and hopefully growing outside of the cycling world as resources, as knowledge bearers, and as change makers, which is really exciting. So that's the background of how we got here, but now let's dig into the actual meat of it. And I like to call this size inclusion 101. Please know, actually, we're going to get into this. This is a topic that we don't talk about a whole lot. So I like to set community expectations. I like to establish some ground rules and know that, because this is a topic we don't talk about a whole lot, there's not a whole lot of knowledge around it. And so as we get into questions, please know there are no dumb questions. I try and approach this from a place of empathy, and that as long as your question is not mean-spirited, I would love to engage with that. And we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, but please do, as I'm going through, ask questions, and Jess will interrupt me, which sounds bad, but she will raise those as they make sense. So, some ground rules for this conversation. The first one is fat is not a bad word. I use it as a neutral descriptor of my own body type. I will not, however, and we'll talk about this a little more, use it for other people to describe other people unless they give me permission, because it is still such an emotionally loaded term. But for the purposes of this conversation, fat is not a bad word. I would also ask that we refrain from diet talk. I don't think this will happen because we don't have a whole lot of discussion in here. But for questions purposes, I don't care what you eat. It's none of my business. And what I eat is none of your business. So we're just not even going to go there. Please also don't body shame yourself or others. You're going to see, I try to use as much imagery of fat bodies as possible in here. And hopefully this will open your eyes, but please don't body shame yourself or others. I would also ask that you be aware of coded language. And what I mean by that is, oh, you're so confident, Marley. Or, wow, you're wearing a bikini. I would never do that. And what I hear when you say that is, if my body looked like yours, I would never be caught wearing something like that. And that might not be your intent there, but some of those coded words can be problematic. I also like to trust intent, but acknowledge the impact. So even though we can have good intentions coming into these conversations and asking questions, sometimes they can still be a little bit hurtful. So just being aware of that. And I really don't anticipate that this is going to come up during this call. But these are kind of the community ground rules I like to set in general. And then finally, just a good reminder that we can't determine somebody's health just by looking at them. And really, it is none of our business whatsoever, unless you're their doctor or therapist. And in this situation, that doesn't apply to any of us. I also want to acknowledge that I have some extreme privilege in this space. So just like age, just like sexuality, just like gender, body size exists on a spectrum. I fall into the small fat category. And I want to acknowledge that the bigger your body gets, so up into the mid fat, super fat, infinifat, and these are all terms that have been coined by the fat community, your access to services, to healthcare, to clothing, to bicycles, they get smaller the bigger your body gets. And so just acknowledging that I do have a level of privilege in this because I am on that smaller end of the spectrum. But that also affords me some privilege, well, obviously privilege, but some power as well. I often think about, if I was 100 pounds heavier, would I be taken seriously in having these conversations? And I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. So some of the topics we're going to cover. So we're going to do a little bit more on the foundational basics. We'll talk a little bit about the market opportunity, some of the challenges. We'll spend some time on case studies and best practices, and then we'll finish up with where to learn more. So as we get into this, I want to acknowledge that biking, backpacking, hiking, all these activities are inherently physical activities. No matter how much we change our attitudes, make equipment that's for bigger bodies, stronger equipment, there will still be some barriers for some people, and that's just how it goes. So just acknowledging that. But our goal with this work is to reduce those barriers and ensure more folks are included and welcome to the conversation. Come on in, it's okay. So I want to talk about language a little bit. We've already talked about the word fat a little bit. Again, I use it as a neutral descriptor of my own body, but when I'm talking about other people, until they have explicitly identified themselves as fat or said, yeah, call me fat. That's what I use. I will use the terms bigger and smaller bodies. People in bigger bodies, people in smaller bodies, and it's just an objective term. Just like you would look at two bicycles and say that bike is bigger than that bike. It's the same thing with human bodies. That human is bigger than that human. And it's an easy way to talk about that. Touched on this briefly, but I try and avoid the terms obese and obesity. They're medicalized terms. They come from the BMI, which is super problematic. If you are a podcast listener, I highly recommend there's a podcast called Maintenance Phase, and they have an episode on the BMI. And it should be required listening for everybody. It talks about the history of it, why it's problematic that we use it for individuals instead of as it was designed for like population-wide basis, etc. But we try and avoid those terms. And then instead of talking about exercise, we try to use the terms joyful movement because that is our goal with All Bodies on Bikes, is to empower people to move joyfully. I also want to talk a little bit about body positivity and body neutrality. So, body positivity is all the rage these days, and it's conversations like, I love my legs, or excuse me, I love my cellulite, I love my rolls, I love my dimples. And we try and practice what's called body neutrality, which acknowledges that we might not love everything about our bodies or like the way that they look, but we appreciate them for what it empowers us to do. So a little bit more on that. So body positivity is like those Dove campaigns. If you remember the Dove commercials where it was all the women, in their underwear and like, I love everything about my body. And honestly, I think it's kind of an unrealistic goal because none of us feel super positively about our bodies 100% of the time, and that's okay. Instead, body neutrality is my body allows me to move in joyful ways. At the end of the day, how I feel about my body has nothing to do with how I feel about myself. I hope that distinction kind of makes sense. And I would encourage you to, instead of calling yourself body positive, and maybe you are 100% in love with your body all the time, and please teach me your ways. But instead, focusing more on that body neutrality of you can be frustrated. I have a bum knee. I have really bad arthritis in my knee, and I'm frustrated with that, but I'm still grateful that I'm able to ride my bike in a non-painful way. Just recognizing some of those nuances. So why does body size inclusion matter? Is it just about getting on bicycles and finding clothing? Spoiler alert, no, it's not. So the average size of a woman in the US is a 16 to 20. We already showed that stat earlier that 70% of the US lives in a larger body. And so it's about access. Right now, body size is not a protected class in 48 states. That means you can be fired. You can be denied housing. You can be denied medical care. It's more than just clothing. It's more than just bikes. This is a society-wide problem, I guess you could say. Some other stats, 53% of women, not just women in larger bodies, but women in general, have been shamed by their doctors because of their weight. And in a study, 45% of British employers said they were less likely to hire a fat interviewee over a thin one. And we think that that's an underreported stat. And be very curious, if we could get stats in the US as well. Also, interestingly, if you've ever learned about unconscious bias, one of the most common unconscious biases that people have is against people in bigger bodies and larger bodied folks. It also costs more to be fat. I love this picture because one, it's clearly the exact same model, the exact same picture, but one of them is a plus size shirt and one of them is not. And the plus size costs $10 more. And you might say, well, Marley, it costs more to have all that extra fabric, and you're 100% correct. But it doesn't feel good to literally be ordering from the same model and know that I'm paying $10 more for the same product, if that makes sense. So kind of wrapping up this section, why does size inclusion matter? We are customers, we are your vendors, we are your patients, we are your coworkers, etc. Sizeism impacts health, money, and employment. There's all sorts of data about people in bigger bodies make less money over their lifetime. It's intersectional. If you add in being a Black woman, a Black plus size woman, that has an impact on how much money you make. There's just so many layers to this conversation. I apologize. There's a phone ringing. I'm gonna do this. There we go. And then finally, everyone deserves to participate fully in any activity that they choose, regardless of their size. Jess, have any questions come in?
Not yet.
Okay, cool. No worries. Please feel free to, everybody's just soaking it all in. So to give you an idea of the plus size market, this is expected to grow 6.4%. So we are a growing segment, and it's absolutely huge. So let's talk about some of the challenges that people in bigger bodies encounter. The bike world isn't made for big people or small people. If you're a smaller person trying to find a bike that doesn't have 700cc wheels, you can probably relate to this. If you're a bigger person and you're trying to find a bike that has a weight limit over 300 pounds, or even locating the weight limit, it can be a really, really hard thing. So digging into some of those challenges specifically, safety is the first bucket. So oftentimes there are prohibitively low weight limits for many bike frames and components. I was just at Sea Otter, and there is a very well-known brand releasing a new set of pedals. The weight limit is 200 pounds on those pedals. I know so many people who would exceed that. And it's a potential safety concern if you're on these pedals and you are, cranking out some watts, climbing a hill, and they break. Finding the weight limit on these components and bike frames can be another challenge. And that's a big project that All Bodies on Bikes is working on, is standardizing that across the industry of where to find the weight limit. And it's interesting, when we talk to most bike brands, they're on board. And one of the things they often say is, you don't need to worry about weight limits. And it's like, okay, maybe that's true because I weigh 250 pounds, but if I weighed 400 pounds, would you be saying the same thing to me? We're doing this advocacy work for people in all sizes. So we really actually do need to worry about those weight limits. Or if we truly don't, then don't put a weight limit on there. But make it consistent, make it known so that way people know where to look. Another compounding factor on this is protective and technical equipment is often not available in bigger sizes. So when we think about mountain biking, knee pads, chest protectors, elbow pads, if you're in a bigger body, let's just hope that you're not sending it or getting rowdy, because finding protective equipment can be very challenging. Kind of the second bucket, and this is the one that gets the most attention, is clothing. The nice thing is, and I'm sure you all know this, you can ride a bike wearing just about anything. You're going to be a lot more comfortable if you have a chamois. If you're riding unbound gravel, you're going to want purpose-built clothing. And the challenge gets bigger, especially the bigger that you get. A lot of brands go up to a double XL, but if you've ever tried on cycling clothing, you know that double XL is more like a medium or a large in regular clothing. So just because they might have the size, they probably don't actually have the size. And then finally, the third one is culture. And this one is a little bit challenging because I think this is changing, but everybody's perception of it is different. So there's this perception that the bike world is pretty exclusive, that I'll be dropped from a ride. And that does indeed happen. I think it's changing pretty rapidly, that more inclusive cycling groups are coming up. But it's a question of inclusive to who. Is your ride truly a no drop ride? And we'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes.
We have a question from the chat about if All Bodies on Bikes works with any bike shops. Our questioner has a great local bike shop, but knows they can be a barrier to folks.
Yes, so that is another project that we're working on. We're not sure what to call it yet. Our working name is kind of like a retailer certification, where basically we would walk bike shops through, we would train them on how to work with customers in bigger bodies, the questions to ask, how to respectfully ask for somebody's weight if they're setting up their mountain bike shocks. So that is a project that we're working on. We've got a committee working on that from folks who currently work in the industry. And then excitingly, I guess it's already May, but later this month, the National Bicycle Dealers Association is coming to Bentonville, and I'm actually giving a workshop on that exact thing. What does the bicycle industry need? What resources do they need? Because I think similar to a lot of us, this is a topic that we want to be informed on, but there's just not a lot of information out there. And so we're workshopping that to figure out what could a certification program look like. So long answer, but it's coming. If there is a specific bike shop that has questions, we're always happy to talk them through things and provide best practices as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because we already kind of talked about it. But this is an example of what I believe this is from Specialized Owner's Manual. So usually the weight limit for a bicycle can be found in the owner's manual. But interestingly, when you're shopping for a bicycle, the owner's manual is probably in the back somewhere that you don't have access to it. And so trying to just standardize where the weight limit information is found. Some other pain points in the bike world, rain gear. Finding, now Cleverhood is a popular thing, so rain capes, some of the more, I guess, flowy fabric is becoming more popular, so that's getting better. We already talked about protective equipment, outerwear for winter. So if you're riding all year round, do you have winter gear that's going to work for you? And then also getting it at an appropriate price point. Oftentimes this stuff is prohibitively expensive. And so making sure that folks of all income levels can get their equipment.
We have another question from the chat.
Okay.
If All Bodies on Bikes has done any work around helmets, especially for those with different styles of hair, because that is a pain point for people. And we had the person asking has been looking for resources on that.
Yes. So a little bit. So REI is one of our partners, and REI was doing a big project on this. And so we helped provide a bunch of testers to REI as they continue to work on this. And then we just try and have the conversation when we talk to helmet dealers about, hey, what are you doing for natural hair? What about people who have locks? And so I know that this is a topic in the industry right now, and we do try and raise it when we're able to. Back to that rain jacket, just kind of a funny thing that happened a couple of years ago. Bicycling Magazine asked me for what was the most impactful product of my year. And my answer was honestly a rain jacket, because it was the first time in my life I had a rain jacket that actually was purpose built for cycling. And I made it into the pages of Bicycling Magazine about a rain jacket, which just feels so silly. But if you've ever had that one product that would really make your life easier, I'm sure you can relate. Just a little bit on sizing. I will preface this by saying this is my sister and this is my good friend Brandy. I have permission to use these photos. So, just to talk about sizing a little bit. So I wear a size 18 in jeans. In t-shirts, I wear a large or a 1X. But in bike gear, I wear anything from a 3X to a 6X. Like, it is all over the place, and there's no consistency there whatsoever. My sister wears about a size 12. She wears a medium, and in bike gear, she wears anything from a large to a 3X. This jacket right here is a 3X. I let her borrow it, and she said, Marley, I would never, ever buy this jacket simply because it has the 3X on it. And, I try and get through to her head of nobody cares what size you're wearing. But there is a very real psychological barrier for a lot of folks when that size doesn't reflect what they believe to be their reality. And so we talk with brands about that a lot. Of accurate sizing is really important for a multitude of reasons. And then just to further illustrate, this is Brandy. She's a tiny human. She wears a size 4, extra small, but in bike gear, she's got everything from an extra small to a large. So just kind of showcasing the wide disparity of sizing there. And I'm sure a lot of folks can relate to this.
We have another question
This is great time.
around the fact that equipment can be really pricey. So the question is if All Bodies on Bikes has done anything around equipment swaps or like gear swaps. I know I can say that All Bodies on Bikes Western Mass just co-hosted one out here. But yeah.
Yeah. I would say yes, exactly like that. So we have 13 chapters, and they're the ones that are actually on the ground leading rides and doing equipment swaps. There's an event coming up later this summer, Grounded Nebraska, and we'll be hosting a big gear swap there. So that's how we're doing it right now. I work, I want to say I work at headquarters, which is actually my house, typically when I'm there. But I'm usually on the more strategic admin side of things. And so I would love to have like a gear library at some point, but we're not quite there yet. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move into the next section, best practices and case studies. So this first one isn't super relevant unless you're in a marketing department, or you have influence over a marketing department. But I think a lot of us, I'm going to go ahead and go through it anyway, because I think a lot of us do have more influence than we think, whether it's with our community group or whether it's, organizing a group ride. These things can be relevant. So the first one is to include diverse bodies in your images. This is a brand that I absolutely love. They're called Super Fit Hero. It's not bike gear. I guess technically you could wear it on the bike, but it's just active wear. They're a really interesting brand. They started out making extra small through, I think, 4 or 5XL, and the demand on the bigger sizes was enough that they were able, and the standard size market for athletic wear is already so saturated that they pivoted and said, we're only making size large through 7XL. And I love them because you look at their website, and I have never, ever seen bodies that look like this in athletic gear. And it is so refreshing to see. And it really just kind of makes you think differently. Digging into some of the details here, they have non-judgmental sizing. So they have, their standard US size, but then they have named their own sizes. So it goes from earth to water to, you guys can read this, fire, star, nova, but there's no judgment there. Instead of saying I'm a 6XL, no, I'm a galaxy fit actually. So kind of fun stuff there. I love that they have this woman here to show how to measure yourself, because a lot of times people in bigger bodies are not going to have the narrowest part of their waist. And that's often what the size charts recommend, is measure the narrowest part of your waist. Well, what if you're apple shaped and you don't have a narrow part? So I love this example. And then one other really cool thing that they do is they have a downloadable measuring tape. So if anybody's ever sewed, a measuring tape is typically 60 inches long. But when we start looking at the size chart, just getting up into the 3XL, 22 to 24, which is a pretty common size, we're already looking at hips that are above that 62 inches. So if your body falls into this bigger end of the size spectrum, how do you measure yourself? How do you know what's going to fit you? And they have a measuring tape that you can download and cut it out and tape it together that goes up to 120 inches. So just removing those barriers again. And I think that's creative thinking that the bike industry could make use of. I think you also want to reflect your target audience. These two photos here are really funny. This bottom one is from Pearl Izumi. And, if you look at who's represented there, I can't tell if these 3 women are the same and just photoshopped. I think 2 of the women might be the same, but the point stands, who is represented? What story are they telling? When I look at these folks up here, I want to hang out with them. They look stylish, they look fun, they look interesting, they look unique. Down here, they kind of look like they need to use the bathroom, honestly. But it doesn't look like a group that I would necessarily feel welcome in. So making sure that whoever you have represented reflects who you want to attend your event, who you want to shop in your store, who you want to go on your group ride, things like that. Couple great examples here. The five borough bike tour, which I'm actually heading to this weekend. I'm so excited about. But I love this. They've got people on hybrid bikes. They've got a guy in just a t-shirt and pants. This one down here, I love it. People are in kits, but they look approachable. They look like they're having fun. They look like normal people. And so I think there's just so much work that can be done on the storytelling side of things, to reflect bigger bodies, diverse bodies, and who you want to attract to your event. Best practice number two, merch and swag. So this is huge in the bike industry. Community organizing, we're always giving out swag. And honestly, I think best practice here is just don't do it. It all just lands in the landfill anyway, but that is my own personal opinion. But if you are going to make t-shirts or hats or whatever, my recommendation is to work with vendors that make extended sizes. Especially when we start thinking about cycling kits, if you're going to have a jersey for your event, there are vendors that make bigger sizes, and sometimes you just have to ask them. Primal is a great example. Steamboat Gravel a couple years ago, their clothing vendor was Primal, and I know that in Primal's custom stuff, they go up to at least a 5XL, but when you went to the Steamboat Gravel website and was looking at merch, it only went up to an XL, I believe. And so I just reached out to Steamboat Gravel and I said, hey, is there a reason why the bigger sizes aren't on here? And they said, no, we have no idea. Let us talk to the vendor. And sure enough, it was just a button they had to press. And so approaching these things with humility and kind of a curiosity, as opposed to Steamboat Gravel hates fat people, they don't have bigger sizes. And, that wasn't the case at all. Just asking the questions can be really helpful. And then, whenever possible, offering non-sized items. So bandanas are great, hats are great, water bottles are great. Although I think most of us have more than enough water bottles for our entire lives. But the point still stands that one size does fit all when it comes to a water bottle. Actually, that's a lie. I have a very tiny bike frame, and sometimes those bigger water bottles don't fit in my bike. But that's not a huge deal. So best practice number three, communication is crucial. So when you're thinking about planning your ride, and I apologize if this presentation seems a little bit scattered, I've kind of put together industry facing presentations, vendor facing, and then community facing. And so I hope this is still helpful, but it does seem a little bit scattered now that I'm putting it all together. But in your communication, overly communicating all the details of the ride. What's the pace and the distance of the ride? What do I need to bring? Who is the ride intended for? Do I need to be able to maintain a certain miles per hour? Are e-bikes welcome? Overly describing what somebody needs to know will help more hesitant people or newer folks show up. And it just helps everybody. Describing if it's a race or an event, making sure that you're clear on how late will aid stations be open? Is there a time cutoff? If you're able to, keeping the finish line open, including food and beverages, or communicating clearly the time that they are closing. And so you can plan appropriately. Like, okay, I know that the finish line celebrations are going to be done at 4 p.m. There is no way I'm riding that far before 4 p.m. I need to bring my own after ride snacks or meal or plan to get a meal. Best practice is to keep them open as long as possible. We know that that's not always possible, but communicating when things are closing down and the average mile per hour somebody would need to maintain to hit that. I hope that makes sense. And then 5 easy ways to make your ride more inclusive. I say easy because they have become a standard practice for all bodies on bikes. And basically, if a ride doesn't have this now, I'm like, nope, I'm not going. So the first one is to be honest about what pace you're going to go and stick to it. Nothing's worse than showing up to a ride that they say it's going to be 12 miles an hour, and then you're going along and it suddenly becomes 13, 14, 15, and that's on the ride leader to hold steady, to have that bike computer or some way of knowing what pace they're going. And then as if other people are pushing them to go faster, saying, nope, we are sticking with this pace. It does take a strong personality to be able to do that, but it's really important. The second one is to publish your intended route before the ride. And this one can be a little bit controversial. A lot of folks, enjoy the thrill of not knowing. But I highly recommend publishing the route, because for those of us that might have a little anxiety or are unsure about hill climbing, just knowing what we're getting ourselves into can really make us feel more confident in showing up to that ride. The third one is to have a sweeper who knows the route and the destination. And you can even one up this one a little bit by having floaters. So for a ride, I recommend 3 leadership roles. So you've got your leader or leaders. You have floaters who are literally moving throughout the ride, communicating from the back to the front. Hey, we've got some folks who are struggling. Let's slow down a little bit. Just having conversation with people and keeping the group together. And then you have the sweeper or sweepers at the back, and these are designated folks to stay at the very back of the group. I like to introduce all those folks at the beginning of the ride so folks know who they can talk to. Hopefully they can talk to everybody, but if they have questions, it really, really helps. It's also helpful if the sweeper has some mechanical skills, because inevitably, if somebody gets a flat tire, they're going to be at the back of the group. And so hopefully your sweeper can effectively change a flat tire. This next one is a huge pet peeve of mine. It's really important to regroup at the top of hills, but actually give people a chance to rest. I can't even count the number of times when I've caught up to the group and I'm huffing and puffing. And I get there and they say, okay, everybody's here, let's go. Give folks a minute to rest. I had a really funny experience one time. I was on a group ride. I was on an e-bike, and I was in the front of the group. And I was like, oh, I get to find out what it's like at the front of the group when we stop and wait for folks. And because I'm typically always at the very back. I'm not a fast rider and I'm okay with it. But especially when it comes to climbing, me and gravity, we do really well going downhill and not so much uphill. Anyway, point being, I was at the front of the group and I was like, ooh, I wonder what people talk about up here. And turns out it was really boring. They just literally hung out and didn't talk to each other. So I kind of like being at the back of the group, but we all have a part to play in that actually, because if you notice that the back of the group has gotten there and the leaders say, hey, let's take off, you can always speak up and say, actually, hey, let's wait another 30 seconds, or hey, let's wait a minute. And nobody's going to say no to that. You're just being a good ally at that point. So good thing for all of us to practice. And then finally, the last thing is to drop judgment-based descriptions like beginner when you actually mean slow. And so I want to be really clear, there's nothing wrong with being a beginner. We all started somewhere, but labeling rides as beginner or advanced doesn't actually give folks the information that they need. They need to know what pace it's going. They need to know any skills they need. Like, do you need to know how to hold like ride in a pace line? Do you need to know how to do single track? What elements do folks need to know to have a successful ride? Anything else that people would add to this? I'm curious if any questions have come in as we're talking about that.
No questions.
Cool. Just comments. All right. Cool.
Just a comment, an agreement of so many water bottles.
Yeah. Okay, so then this last section, just kind of wrap up a little bit and then we'll have time for Q&A. But so a couple more considerations, a little bit of conversation on allyship, to go on to what we just talked about, and then resources for where to learn more. So events and physical spaces. So thinking about how do people move through the space. I often think about weddings or conferences where you have those round tables with a million chairs around them. Can people move comfortably around the room and through the tables, through the chairs, etc. With the chairs, who can sit comfortably? Those white folding chairs, I avoid those at all costs because I don't know if they're going to support my weight. It's kind of an interesting thing to go into a space and look around the room at who is sitting, who can comfortably sit. Are there arms on the chairs that would prohibit somebody in a bigger body from being comfortable? Also thinking about access, can somebody who uses a cane or who uses a walker or a wheelchair, can they access your space? What about if there's a parent with a stroller? Can they access your space as well? And then we already talked about this, but swag. Can you make swag that is non-sized? So let's talk about being an ally for a couple minutes. The biggest thing that you can do is to use your privilege. And you might say, but Marley, I'm pretty marginalized. I don't have a lot of privilege. We all have some level of relative privilege, and this is the time to use it. Some things that you can do is you can take on the emotional labor for your fat-bodied friends. You can speak up in groups. If you're going to a restaurant and they ask if you want a booth or a table, advocating for the table, so everybody can sit comfortably. Booths are often not very fat friendly. And once you start paying attention to this and becoming aware of it, you'll see that there's a lot of spaces that are very size restrictive. Another great example of this is like, let's say you're going on a group bike ride with your friends. You're traveling somewhere and you're renting bikes. Your friend who lives in a larger body is probably already thinking, oh gosh, are they going to have bikes that support me? Is my body going to fit? You can call ahead and ask, hey, do you have any weight limits on your bikes? Or let's say you're going horseback riding, call ahead and then just letting the group know, hey, I already checked, the weight limit's 250 pounds. Is this an activity that'll still work for folks? Instead of calling out, your bigger bodied friends specifically. Because I guarantee you, your friends are already thinking about it, or your friends in bigger bodies. Speaking about riding specifically, ask your friends what their preference is. Do they want you to wait? Do they want you to ride together the whole time? I enjoy being alone as long as the group waits for me. Kaylee, for example, my co-founder, doesn't like to be alone. And so you can't just assume that bigger body people want you to wait for them at all times. Like, just ask, hey, do you want to ride together? Do you want to regroup? What's our plan here? And I think that's honestly a really good practice, regardless of body size. Can be really helpful there. Another thing you can do is support brands that make inclusive sizing. So letting them know, hey, I'm buying from you, XYZ brand, because you make bigger sizes. One kind of fun game I like to play, or it makes it real, is if you needed to buy 1 or 2 sizes bigger than what you are buying, could you? And if the answer is no, maybe think about a different brand. Because our money, or excuse me, the money that we spend does have power, and we want to support the brands that are actually making inclusive sizing. And then finally, just watch your compliments. They may be an insult. I can't tell you how many times I've been climbing a hill and people are like, you can do it, you're almost there. And it's like, would you say that to me if I was like in a normal, I don't want to say normal size body, in a smaller body? And when I've talked to friends who, were on the same ride together, I'm like, hey, did those people say anything to you? They're like, no. And it's like, oh, they cheered on for me like I was an Olympian. And it's like, it's hard to know what people's intent is. But back to that acknowledge impact thing, just being aware of how you are communicating to other folks. Okay, so now some resources where to learn more. My biggest recommendation here is to diversify your social media feed. I've got a bunch of other fat creators on here and other bigger bodied groups. Follow those, because the more you normalize seeing people in bigger bodies, the more normal it's going to become to you, and then it becomes part of your consciousness of, how do I be a good ally? How do I be more inclusive? It just becomes part of your everyday. I already talked about it before, but Maintenance Phase is an incredible podcast. She's also an author. Her name's Aubrey Gordon. I don't have those books on here, but I will send them out before I send this presentation over to Jess. But there's a couple called What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat that gets into some of the details of all of this, some of the research that's being done, and has really tangible solutions. And then I would just encourage you to reach out. Happy to answer questions one-on-one. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and go into Q&A.
Thank you so much, Marley.
Thank
Um,
you.
so anyone, if you want to unmute and ask a question, or just ask a question in the chat, please feel free. I know in the chat, KJ said that one thing that she makes sure they do before rides is do the hand signals and safety talk, as something that you can include in your inclusive ride stuff.
Yes, 100%.
Um,
And I'm on the chat now, so I can see it.
oh,
So
great.
yeah, is there someone I consider to be a mentor? If so, how do they help you? Yes, I'm going to answer this in 2 ways. So as far as size inclusion, I look to Jenny Brusso. So she is the founder of Unlikely Hikers. And she's on Instagram as Unlikely Hikers, I believe, and Jenny Brusso. And I have just learned so much from her in terms of body neutrality. What does fat activism actually look like? The intersectionality of fat activism. I didn't really touch on this at all, but things like income levels and your color. People of color face even more barriers to getting access to all sorts of things. Jess, thank you for putting that in there. So Jenny is a huge mentor to me in terms of the body size inclusion space. And then in cycling, quite a few folks. My co-founder, Kaylee Kornhauser, she is so strong and just does everything from a community mindset, which can be really helpful in the work that we do. So those are my mentors there. Other questions? And Kaylee's, I don't know if Kaylee's Instagram is private or not, but you can always request to follow her. So, oh, this is a great question. Yeah, thoughts on how biking infrastructure on road, on trail is or is not size inclusive. I'd say most of it is fairly size inclusive. There's when I think about this, I think about adaptive cycling, people who might be using 3 or 4-wheeled bicycles. And I think there's a lot more awareness of that, especially when we're thinking about off-road infrastructure. And there's a lot of work to be done there, but typically most greenways are fairly size inclusive. I always think bike lanes can be wider as more and more people are commuting and using them. Give us more space. We're already taking up less space, but give us more space. But the other thing that I think about here is crossing times. So, if you're climbing a hill and you have a controlled intersection, giving people longer to cross. It's not necessarily related to size, but speed. And typically people in bigger bodies are going to be a little bit slower, especially if they're fighting gravity. Yeah, Doug.
Hey, so I'm Doug. I'm the chair of Mass Bike. Thank you so much for coming up and doing this presentation.
Thank you.
It's clear that cycling manufacturers are just like have a huge untapped market and need to be reaching out to it. We have the same conversation. Why are you making bikes just for racers and not for everyday riders
Yep.
that go along with it? So thank you so much for doing the presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think honestly, that's kind of why we've been successful is we've just made the economic case of, the racers and the pointy end are a very small segment of who's actually buying bicycles and who's riding bikes. And if we can target and reach that 74% of the population, not only are more people going to be moving their bodies, and you may have noticed I avoided all discussions of health. It's not our job to dictate or mandate health to anybody, but we all know that moving our bodies is good for us. It's good for us mentally, it's good for us physically. Bodies are meant to move. And so we try and make that case to them. I was just out at Sea Otter, and it feels like brands are starting to move that way, especially in like the e-mobility category of, cargo bikes and e-bikes and that sort of thing. But there's still a lot of work to be done on the rest of the bike industry. Any other questions? And please do feel free to reach out. All right.
Oh,
Well, Catherine, pass my message on to them, please. And we can definitely hook up there. I will also say, and I'm not even going to try and pull it up right now, we have a lot of resource guides on allbodiesonbikes.com. We've got resource guides for folks looking to buy a bike, talking about frame material. Steel is going to be your best friend. Talking about wheels, clothing. We've got lists there, people that make plus size clothing. So yeah, allbodiesonbikes.com/resources. So thank you so much. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. I hope it was useful, and happy Bike Month. It's hard to believe it's already May.
thanks, Marley. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll give a Massachusetts plug to the Western Mass chapter of All Bodies on Bikes. I'm located out in Northampton. Jacob and Lee are doing a lot of stuff this spring. So if anyone is in Western Mass or wants to come out and ride in Western Mass, I highly recommend going to their events. I know they're going to be doing a bike packing workshop in a couple weeks, and they're going to be doing the Swift camp out in June if you are interested in bike camping at all. So a lot of exciting stuff happening with All Buddies and Bikes Western Mass out here.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.